Presentation is about Xiki. Xiki is a UI language, a language for creating user interfaces. I'm Craig Muth. I've been evolving Xiki for about 10 years. You can go to ziki.org to download and install Xiki. What do you think the simplest possible way of creating a user interface is? It's an interesting question, isn't it? The simplest possible way to create a UI. What do you think it is? I would argue there really aren't any really simple ways of creating a UI, and that there should be. That's kind of what this presentation is all about. UIs are very important, not just the UIs that we create for our end users, but the UIs we create for ourselves and for other developers. They're also very important and kind of undervalued, in my opinion. I'm going to do two things in this presentation. I'm going to do a lot of awesome Xiki demos, number one. And number two, I'm going to try to convince you that the time has come for a lightweight UI language. A language that makes it really simple to create UIs. A language that is very generic, so it can bring together these existing UI paradigms. And what I mean by that is the UIs you make with this language, without a whole lot of extra coding, should be usable as web UIs, command line UIs, mobile UIs, desktop UIs. These are some pretty ambitious goals. So Xiki probably shouldn't try to solve all UI problems. It should probably focus in on one thing and do it really well. And what Xiki focuses in on is nested menus. If you analyze most UIs, they boil down to nested lists of choices. You've got a list of options. You click on one, and then you see another list presented in various forms. Xiki tries really hard to utilize existing languages and tools to let them solve some of the problems of UIs. The three things that you get when you install Xiki are a web server, a Xiki shell command, and editor plugins. The web server and the editor both delegate to the Xiki shell command. So Xiki, the shell command, is at the core of the language, which is how things are with most languages. When people think up new user interfaces, they sometimes go to a whiteboard and write out an outline. Let's say you're making up a mobile UI for plane flights. You might go to a whiteboard and write out book flight, check-in, flight status, and indented underneath book flight, you might put one way and round trip. You might write out an outline like this one, a simple indented outline of the items in your UI. Well, why can't that be a language for creating user interfaces, where you just type out an indented outline of the items? Really, that's all the information you need to create a working UI. Why can't it be that simple? Here is a mobile interface being dynamically rendered from this outline, actually from this text file, which is a text version of the outline. The only difference is that there are slashes at the end. That syntax is inspired by URLs and paths. They sort of make these lines behave like directories. We can edit this file here and save and refresh over here to verify that this is being backed by this file. This is the Xiki language. I'll refresh and make it go away for now. You can see that it's showing the unindented items first, book flights, check-in, and flight status. And as you might guess, when you click on book flight, it's going to show you one way and round trip because they're indented underneath. With most frameworks, even the more compact UI and web frameworks, making a simple UI like this can take multiple files, many lines of code, and boilerplate, often in multiple languages, even with GUI tools. There can be a lot of clicking and dragging and typing stuff involved to make a simple UI like this. I say it should be doable in one file and 5 lines. If it's simple, it should exist. All right, well, what would it take a language like this to be really useful? Let's try adding a couple things to our file here. Let's add an about item at the top And underneath it, let's put strange loop flights. And if I refresh that, you can see the item shows up. I can drill into it. And since I didn't put a slash at the end, it shows that it's plain text. You can add a heading by using a greater than, I'll say summary. So if we refresh this, you can see the summaries there. You can go down here and add dynamic behavior using an exclamation mark. I'll say 2 times 200. And if we go to this round trip item, we'll see that it runs the code. Book flight round trip and shows the output. This is Ruby code by default, but it can also be other types of code. Since this is just running on localhost :8161, we can open it in a web browser. So let's do that. Let's open it in a normal web browser. This web browser is this web server is a little server that comes with Xiki that renders files like these as mobile menus. There's also a Rails plugin that will let Rails apps do this, and other web frameworks can shell out to the Xiki shell command to do this. One thing the web has taught us about UI is URLs are very useful. It's really convenient for users to be able to jump to specific parts of your app. So it probably makes sense for a simple UI language like this to have URLs built into it so that it can do things like paths. If we go in and look at the URL, as we click on these items, you can see that it adds what we click on to the URL. If we click on book flight, it'll add it to the URL. If we click on round trip, it'll add it. Just like web servers do with directories, except in our case, everything is just in one file. OK, if all a language did was rendered files in a web browser as a mobile interface, that wouldn't be really, really useful. Let me actually try to close this and bring it up again. Don't know why it was showing it as a different text size. It's just a text file. This web server is kind of cool, even though it's simple, because if you drop a Xiki plugin into your web app, that means even non-techie users can go to URLs that don't exist. And I'll go to car rentals, and they'll be prompted to make menus, and they can contribute UIs to your app. Let's make Avis and rent a car and put a heading underneath it. So you can add UIs to an actual app, and then the developers can link to them, even Ajax to them to use it in their app. But if you think about it, this outline style isn't limited to just mobile. Really, it can apply to all of these paradigms, all these UI paradigms. So we've seen accessing our flights menu with mobile, and then we've accessed the mobile interface through the web app. How about the other ones? How about command line? What would that look like? Let's bring up a terminal, and I'll type Xiki, which is the main shell command that comes with Xiki, and I can put flights after it, and we can navigate our flights menu on the command line. If we add something to the end of the path, can hit return, and it will drill in and show the options. How about GUI? Where's this? How about accessing our flights menu with a desktop GUI, rather? What would that look like? Here is a very simple desktop UI that is going to read in our flight file and render the UI as a desktop interface. book flight, round trip. How about voice? Here's a really simple script that is going to present using voice the same menu.
For about, press 1. For book flight, press 2. For check-in, press 3. For flight status, press 4.
It's pretty obvious, right? It's just reading in and displaying the unintended item
For
first.
one-way, press 1. For round trip, press 2.
And of course, you could make that into a voice recognition interface pretty easily with a pretty small step. Well, how about this last one, this text UI paradigm that's been floating around here? What's that all about? Text as a UI paradigm. That's kind of what most of the rest of the presentation is about. As I mentioned earlier, I think the UIs that we developers make for ourselves and for other developers are very important. So how could a language like this be used to help out developers? Developers use interfaces that are very close to the metal. They run shell commands. They run code. They search in files. They navigate files. They're not going to click around in a little mobile interface. But you can sort of see how you could do things that users, techie users, developers can use as well. File paths. The path to this would be users/craig/shoppinglists.txt. That's fairly obvious. For SQL and other languages developers use, the path to these rows would be select star from users / and then this row. That seems kind of weird, but I think it'll make more sense in a moment here. So here is a plain text file on my desktop. You can see it's just a .txt file, which is about the simplest kind of file there is. I'm going to double click on it to open it in a text editor and then delete the contents so we can type some stuff. Fortunately, most of the text editors and IDEs that people use these days are extendable, which is where the Xiki text editor plugin comes in. Let's start with a couple examples of how this might work. Let's start with two examples that you're probably familiar with. Typing URLs and double-clicking or clicking to view them in the web browser. Let's go loc, since I'm not connected to the internet. So you've probably all seen apps that let you do this. A lot of email clients let you do this. Click on a URL once it's been typed. Since the Xiki plugin is enabled, we can double-click on any line, and it will open up the URL in the browser. You can also do control return by default if you prefer keyboard shortcuts. And all this text editor plugin is doing is shelling out to the Xiki shell command, not surprisingly, and passing in whatever the user clicks on. So let me paste that there, and you can see it does the same thing. So how about another example? How about SQL statements? You've probably all seen GUI tools, SQL GUI tools that let you type SQL statements and double-click to run them. The text editor plugin is going to work the same way. It's going to just shell out to the Xiki shell command, pass that line. And this time, there's output that we need to display to the user. So how should we do that? How about a really simple lowest common denominator solution so that we can make plugins for other editors and IDEs pretty easily? How about we just insert the results underneath indented two spaces, which you can see is what Xiki does. This makes some of the other challenges of UI easier to do. So far, everything we've done has been read-only, so we should probably start thinking about our creating and our updating strategy, and maybe some of that will spill back over to some of the other UI paradigms. So once you've got the text in here in your text editor, everything is plain text. So the obvious way to edit is just to edit inline and then double-click or control-enter to save back to the database. And we can collapse, and we can see that the change took effect. And the creating strategy becomes pretty obvious too. You can either just type something in, or you can start with an initial record and make a new one. And double click to save it back. And if we collapse, we can see that it created the record. This isn't as elegant in a lot of ways as a full-fledged GUI SQL tool that will let you, click on the column titles to sort. But in other ways, it is pretty elegant. Let's say you want to make a change to a record, but you're not absolutely positive about it. If you've got text, you can just copy and paste to make a version, and you can update. And if you didn't like it, you can just roll back by launching that. That's really clunky to do in a GUI. So you can start to see how the editing paradigm in Xiki works. You just edit whatever you got out. You just change it and send it back to Xiki. And the other UI paradigms can do the same thing. They can read and modify and just write back to the URL. Undo is also kind of cool to have in the context of UIs like this. All right, everything I've shown you so far has been black and white to make it clear that everything is text. But there is optional formatting. I'm going to change the background to black, and I went into a presentation mode, which is a editor-specific feature, so I won't go into it. I'm going to focus on the general stuff. It turns out you can type all kinds of things that developers like to use. If you want to see what your IP is, you can just type IP and double-click on it. That's just shelling out to the Xiki shell command. Code, you can type code. This is Ruby code, but you can also type JavaScript code. If it looks like JavaScript, it'll run as JavaScript. You can just double-click on it or Control-Enter. Shell commands just begin the line with a $, and it runs it as a shell command. Directories, you can just type a directory, double-click. Let's narrow down to the foo project. If the menu outputs pluses and minuses, they behave as optional bullet points. So you can use the mouse to drill in just like you do a normal GUI file tree. If you drill into a source file, it'll show you the methods. You can double-click to navigate to the file. If you want to run a shell command in a specific directory, you can combine these syntaxes together. You just indent the shell command 2 spaces underneath the directory. Everything is still plain text, by the way. I can turn off the formatting to show you. So if I double-click on that, it'll run that shell command in that directory. If you want to run async commands, use a %. If you want to have iterm, for example, run something, you use an ampersand. So this is an example of Xiki utilizing other tools to handle some of the UI challenges. You can show all files and type to narrow down. I just typed RB to narrow down to all the Ruby files. This # syntax will search. So let's search for DEF space in all the source files. And you can type to narrow down. This is going to search for install. ** will search for file names. You can map searches and everything else to keyboard shortcuts. So I'm going to search for food in the Xiki directory using a keyboard shortcut. Editing or creating files, how do you think that works? Probably just edit inline, right? Edit the output. So if you want to comment out a gem, you can expand the file and update it inline, and you can see that it changed. And if that file didn't exist, it would create it. OK, here is an example of a UI working with a web browser, a text UI working with a web browser to create a GUI UI. This is kind of like on the Wii when you choose your character. Just going through and picking options. Unicorn hair is the coolest hair option, clearly. You can type address book, and it will delegate to the Mac address book app. You can type iTunes to control iTunes. Pause, play. You can go into your songs. Let's see. Go to the next song. Piano, you can make up your own sounds, and it will send the notes to a MIDI device. This nested plain text environment is really nice for making up your own DSLs. This is a DSL for randomizing music notes in a really simple way. When it gets to the end, it reruns the stuff at the bottom. It's changing the key change in between each, changing the tempo. If you make a song that you like, you can just indent it underneath a string with a slash at the end, and then save it. And then later on, if you want to listen to it, you can type the name of your string anywhere and bring it back up. This editor is Aquamax, by the way, which is a very user-friendly version of Emacs. Here is Vim. Vim isn't fully supported, but you can do basic stuff. Go into insert mode, type a SQL statement, and control return to show the output. A lot of people want Vim support, more full Vim support in Xiki, and I definitely want to do that. I'm looking for people that are willing to pair with me on it. Here is a code mirror prototype. So let you edit stuff in the browser. It's very limited, but you can do headings. And here's a prototype of control enter. Sublime, third-party wrote a Sublime plugin. All right, the reason Xiki has all of these examples is because, and all these syntaxes you can type is because it's really easy to create syntaxes. As I mentioned in your home directory, there's a menu directory. Here are all my custom directories and files to make menus. In the Xiki directory itself, there's a menu directory that has all the menus that come with Xiki. There are a lot of them. If a language wants to be UI focused, it should probably have the best Hello World experience. The Hello World in Xiki is you just make a .txt file in a directory, and that's it. So let's make a hello file. Let's edit it and say hi, loop, save it, and now I can type hello and use it from a text editor. If you have a Xiki plugin installed, I can run it on the command line. Here, let's have iterm run this command. You just do Xiki and then the name of your file. You can run it in the web browser just by going to localhost 8161 and then slash whatever the name of your file was. By the way, the 8161 is the port because the way I styled it, it looks kind of like XIKI, the way I styled the logo. The shark is kind of helping to make the K look like a 6. It's kind of a stretch, but makes it easier to remember. OK, so another hello world. If you're in a text editor and you know your file is going to be a .txt, you can just type the name of your file, .txt. It'll give you a little example, and then you can just double-click to create it, and you can type hey and double-click to use it. It can also be a .rb file. Let's just use the default. It can also be a JS file. Bootstrap, this one's kind of cool. If you just type something .bootstrap, it'll give you a example Bootstrap DSL layout, and then you can view that in the web browser. Let's go update this. You can see it change. It's randomizing the colors just to give you some ideas what you might want it to look like. .menu is the default Xiki language two-space indenting format. You can also make menus inline. So if this menu didn't exist yet, I can just type it out and type a keyboard shortcut and then immediately go in and start using it. That brings the language over into the realm of an interactive language where there's no need for a REPL. You can just type things out and immediately start using them. Let's make up a new UI for Snitter, which is Twitter for snakes. An idea whose time has clearly come. Let's type out a few options: sign in and sneet. I don't know. It's horrible. Hiss times 2. Sorry, I apologize for these examples, they're horrible. So I can type a keyboard shortcut, and then I can immediately start using the UI I just created. And of course, you can view all these in the web browser and start using them. You can type keyboard shortcuts to jump to the source of any file that you're using, any menu you're using. You can define menus inline. This will make it so that if you click on a line that says hi, it'll run the block. Every sort of simple way of making UIs I tried to work in here. So if you try something that you think like, hey, maybe this will work, chances are it might work. This is a regular expression. If a line begins with AAA, it'll run the block. There are many ways of making menus. This is how you programmatically run a menu. The .expand method is the same as the brackets. It's kind of at the core of the language if you use it directly through Ruby. These are defining keyboard shortcuts. This one here will make Control-D, Control-S show this table. And then, of course, you can edit it and do everything else. It pops up a new view. This is a dead simple Ruby class with methods. And if we create that, it will use the methods as the first level of menus, and it will run them when you expand them. If you don't know how to make a menu a certain way, you can just type it out, double click, it'll say, hey, it doesn't exist yet, and it will give you a bunch of options of different ways you can make things. In code, there are a lot of kind of sophisticated OO options for merging declared menus with classes and doing routing to map some of the items to classes. Here's a menu that's a directory. You can just type adir, and the files in the directory will be the menu items. And when you expand them, it'll run the files. Here's an example of a very simple dynamic menu. Here it is right here. Let me create it. And if I expand this, it will show tables. I can type to narrow down because Xiki does that by default. And I can go in and view the tables. So this menu here is implemented completely by this file, which has just these two lines. This first line says, if there isn't an argument passed in, just show all the tables. The second one says, else, do a select star. So it's kind of the thinnest possible way of making a little UI on top of a lot of tools. All right, so using Xiki as a web development tool, how would that work? If you want to try out some HTML, you can just type HTML, gives you a little example, and you can edit it, double click again to see it update, so you don't even have to know HTML, you can just type it. CSS, you can just type CSS, and it will give you some default CSS. You can change it. So if you don't know CSS, this is a really quick way of learning it. JavaScript, you can type JavaScript, run some stuff in the browser. If you prefer coffee, you can type coffee, and it runs that in the browser. So the idea here, as you can kind of see probably, is you should be able to just type any word that you think a web developer would want to use. Bootstrap, you can type bootstrap and type a little DSL that we saw earlier. Greater than for headings, it'll render it in the browser. When you double click, I'm going to make a couple paragraphs. By default, if you sandwich them together, they'll be columns, but if you make them separated by a blank line, it'll make them in separate rows. You can do the cool bootstrap multi-column stuff by adding blank lines in certain places. Then you can drill into the bootstrap menu to see other examples. DOM, let's bring up this bootstrap app and type DOM, and then we can drill into the DOM to go in and mess with stuff. Let's go in and edit this H1. You can see the change happened over here in the browser. If you know the ID of an element, you can just type the ID directly with a pound, and it will expand it out. You can see it's blinking it, and we can go edit it this way and update it. If you don't know the IDs, you can just type IDs, and it will expand out and show you all your IDs. You can search in the DOM by this ## syntax. So that found this line here, and you can expand it out and edit that. Rails, this R menu here lets you run code inside of the context of a Rails app, like a Rails console. If you do something that returns active record objects, it will recognize that and let you edit and double click to save back. So we can expand again to see that it saved the change. You can interact with request headers. Models, you can just type models. So kind of any word that you think you should be able to type, give it a try, see if it works. It might redirect you to another place if it doesn't work. So here are the models in my app. I can type to drill in, and it gives me a few options. This @ just means ignore everything else and run this in isolation. So we can go and type alligator.new, and it'll give us the blank YAML. We can create a record just by editing the blank YAML and double-clicking, and it will save it back to create the record. So we can do a .last, and we can see that it just created our record. This is really nice and kind of a cool way of interacting with the Rails app. It's slicker than a Rails console in a lot of ways. You could make the same menu for Node just by embedding a controller in Node. Here is expanding out a Rails menu underneath a Rails app. You can make new resources, et cetera. It'll give you, or controllers, it'll give you default values that you can just pick from. Markdown, here is some Markdown code that you can just edit to try out. Haml, here's some Haml. Node, here's a Node controller. We can just edit and double click again, and it will run restart the server and run the controller. So if you want to get started with a tool like Node and you have Xiki, typing the name of the tool and then just editing the examples, I think is the fastest possible way of getting started with a new tool. You can search on the website and get running in a few minutes. This is literally like 15 seconds. You got a working example. Backbone. Here's the Rails plugin I mentioned earlier. Here's a Rails app. And if I go to a URL that doesn't exist, the Xiki plugin will prompt me to make UIs in the context of that app. All right, so I've got other screencasts you can find on the web, and my RubyConf talk went into a lot of detail about how you can use Xiki as a shell console replacement. It's really slick. Shell consoles haven't changed much in 40 years. Here, I'll show you a couple things. Here's a keyboard shortcut that will search for recent commands in a specific directory, and then you can type to narrow down to rerun commands. That in itself is really useful. Most shell commands will show you all the recent, most shells will show the recent commands run in all directories. You can make notes that you wrap around the shell commands that you type in text files, and then you can share those text files with other people, and they can use the commands. So you're sort of making a little documentation / UI that's interactive. You can run remote shell commands and edit remote files. You can wrap little UIs around shell commands to make them a little easier to use. Chmod, if you don't remember what they are, you can just indent it underneath your file, and then it gives you default options that you can just click on to run. Okay, Xiki is a note-taking tool. You can make text files full of notes with greater than for headings, like this one. And then you can type keyboard shortcuts to see an outline of your notes, and then type to narrow down. So here are my Ruby notes. Here's my MD5 note. I can jump to it and then run the code. Here's the output. When you're in a file that has notes, you can type a keyboard shortcut to show all of the headings in that file, and type to narrow down, and then jump to the section. You can add interactive memorizing to notes in your file. This is inspired by memorize.com, which is another one of my projects. So if you double click on this, it gives you a little interactive memorizing mode where you can memorize the notes that you create. Xiki as an IDE. You can split your text editor windows and have a file tree down here that you can use just like a GUI file tree, but it's all text, so you can edit the stuff that you don't care about, delete, add notes in your file tree, fix this. On the top left, I usually put shell commands and things I interact with. Here's a keyboard shortcut that shows all the methods in my project, and I can type to narrow down. Here's a little menu that I created for a sample app that I can use to do standard common things like browse it in the web browser, run the unit tests, run common rake tasks. If you're a new developer and you come onto a team and you have a little menu like this, you can just type. It's a way better experience than people saying like, oh yeah, you have to type all these commands and here are the rake tasks. Why shouldn't we make developers like, or UIs like this for developers that come onto our teams? Git, here is a visualization of all the Git changes I need to make. You can commit files together. Phone call. Unit tests, you can drill in and run unit tests inline. And if there's an error, you can jump to the error. You can browse Xiki gems. You can edit Mongo if you forget where your Apache config files are. You can just type Apache. Just a couple quick examples of using Xiki as a rapid prototyping tool. Here's a little UI that has a mobile interface like we've seen, and if you drill into some of the items, they have bootstrap displays of the individual menu items, which is really easy to do. Let's see, skip this stuff. D3, SVG, 3JS. As more people start using and contributing to Xiki, people are contributing more of these menus. So eventually, hopefully every word that you would think of to type will either do something that you would expect it to, or send you in the right direction. Here's a cool shoes example that I just pulled from the shoes website. All right, who won the battle between GUI and text? There's been this battle going on for decades on two fronts, the end user and the developer tools. GUI largely has won the end user battle, but development tools are still dominated by text. The files that we create in our projects are just text files. We have access to them. We don't have to go through some GUI that encapsulates the files. Why is that? Why is text still going strong in the development community? New projects like Rails and Node, they're text first. There's absolutely no GUI, and then people add on GUIs after the fact to augment them. Wikis, Twitter is using text as part of their UI. You can just type @ or pound as a user. You don't have to press a button. Facebook recently adopted this, and with Wikipedia being very text heavy, that's 3 of the top 10 websites that have text as a very integral part of their UI. So what we didn't foresee, I think, a couple decades ago when we thought GUI was going to take over all development tools, is that developing in languages and text was going to continue to improve as well. And the small set of formats, like HTML, XML, and JSON, those, in my opinion, are a big part of what has made our lives as developers easy and better over the last few years. The future of UI is largely going to be voice recognition, which changes the relationship. Users are now going to say, like, hey, I told my app to do something and didn't know how to do it, instead of saying, like, don't give me too many options. So we're going to have to start engaging in these textual conversations with our users. Okay, that's just about it. If you like where Xiki is going, there's a Git tip button on ziki.org. Please consider donating. I'm keeping my eye out for sponsor companies. I'd probably open to adding a menu for your tool in the core Xiki distribution. I think if I'm transparent about that, users won't mind. I think pair programming is the future of how all of us developers are going to connect with each other. Follow me at Xiki on Twitter and tweet, and we'll hook up and we'll do a pairing session. There's no commitments. I'm not looking for contributors. I'm just looking for people to pair for me with 1 hour. I've done like 30 of them. They've all been great. I've done remote and local sessions. I'll find something that is fun for you to work on, and I promise I'll keep it fun. And that's all I got. Thanks a lot.